Well guys, today we're going to go over a quick in-depth guide to drawing hands, but before we get there, as I mentioned in the description of my last YouTube video, I'm kind of all over the place for the month of August, so the time between videos may be shorter or longer depending on when I'm home and how much time I can put into a video. That being said, the content is still coming out, so let's just get right into the video. So the first thing we're going to go over is the major masses of the hand. The first being the palm and the second being the thumb. So the palm can be drawn as a rectangular shape that comes to a point at our fingers, or you can round it out. Which one you choose doesn't particularly matter, but what does matter is you want to make sure it's not a perfect square. If you keep it as a perfect square, it's very easy for your fingers to look awkward and misplaced. It just doesn't mimic reality. Now, moving on to the base of the thumb, there's going to be a lot of fleshy mass right here, and overall it's going to form a triangular shape up until the first joint. Once we get to this point, I'm going to draw two C curves for the outside of the thumb, and then come right back for the inside. This is by no means the final silhouette we're going to use in our drawing. However, it does give me enough confidence to start moving forward with the rest of the drawing. It's important to cover what the wrist actually does. So the wrist handles the turning of the hand up and down and side to side, not the rotation. The rotation is handled by the forearm. What's also important when drawing the wrist is to remember it's not a perfect cylinder. It's roughly 2 heights in width. In addition, we want to include this drop from the wrist to the hand to make sure our figures are true to life. Our hands are much more limited in movement from side to side than up and down. For example, if you take the thumb side of your hand and try moving it out, our thumb joint would roughly be in line with the silhouette of our forearm, whereas if we moved our hand straight down, we can get it almost at a 90-degree angle. So it's important, if we're not intentionally trying to turn the wrist side to side, just keep it in line with the forearm. This is by all means the simplest way to go about it, even though you can move your wrist slightly. Now, I'm going to give you a more anatomically accurate way of drawing fingers, as well as a simpler way that you could use depending on how much of the drawing is actually taken up by your hands. There's no point in going to critical detail if the hand is going to take up a tiny portion of the canvas, right? So, quick and easy, I want you to draw the fingers as 2 separate links, with the further link being slightly longer than the first link. Even though our fingers are made out of 3 separate bones, the movement of this final bone right here complements the middle one before it. It doesn't usually move independently of its own. I guess you can if you're double jointed. In situations where you're not clenching your fist or closing your palm slightly, this is a way of simplifying your art and thus speeding up the drawing process. The reason why I want you to use this for smaller portions of the drawing is because if you put maximum detail into every tiny little thing in the drawing, first of all, it's going to take you a ton of time. Secondly, it's a little bit noisy, right? You want to kind of contrast the detail of things that take up a larger portion or are closer to the camera than those that are far away or take up a smaller portion of the camera. Use your own judgment as necessary. Obviously, you can apply the details I'm about to talk about on top of this if you feel it needs a little bit more definition. For the more accurate method, we're going to actually be drawing out all the 3 different sections of the fingers. So, from the top down, our hands are going to form 3 separate links, each getting progressively shorter as we get closer to the end of the finger. And for this final section, roughly half of it will be taken up by a nail. Notice I'm not keeping these as perfectly symmetrical cylinders. I'm tapering them in and out depending on where the joints are. I like just creating these sort of diamond shapes for the first joint just because I feel like it assists me later in the drawing process when I touch up the silhouette. From a side view, I like keeping the tops of the fingers fairly angular and sharp, whereas the bottom I keep pretty rounded out. This is because the bottom of the fingers have thick, rounded pads that round out our form and make it softer, whereas the tops, they have much less distance between the bones and tendons and the skin. One thing to point out is I'm also shaving down the size of these joints the further away we get from the knuckle, right? The knuckle should be biggest, then this next joint should be second, and then once you get to this final one, it should be pretty small. And as you can see right here, similar to how we dropped the wrist down slightly when we got to the hand, I also want you to include this slight drop once we hit the nail on the final section. This is just going to make it a little bit more accurate, although obviously guys, if the hand is very small, you're not going to notice this, so don't draw it in. Draw this in 3 more times. Your middle finger should be the longest and your pinky should be the smallest. As for the index and ring finger, if you have more testosterone in the room, generally the ring finger is going to be bigger and the pointer finger is going to be slightly shorter than it. However, there's so much variance that this isn't like a hard and fast rule, you know, you could adjust it however you feel fit. Now we're going to quickly go over the names of the bones in the hands. It's not actually the most relevant, you know, each and every one of these, but this is going to help us with our language later on. You'll notice there's a bunch of tiny interlocking bones in the beginning of the wrist called the carpals. These are one of the reasons why it's a little tricky to draw the wrist in high definition, because these form kind of irregular shapes and they all bunch up at the beginning of the hand. So the main thing you need to know about these is when you bend your wrist down, these are actually going to come out a little bit more and you're going to see the bones protrude a little bit more. Now, moving past this, before we actually get to our finger bones, we have the metacarpals. These are very similar in shape to the bones in the fingers. However, they have a ton of skin in between them, forming our palm. Now, we're going to talk about the thumb. So the thumb is made out of 3 bones, similar to our fingers. However, these are much more thick and rugged. Now, this first bone right here is very similar to our metacarpals, in that there's a lot of fleshy mass right here, as well as some webbing that's going to connect it to our palm. Now, this webbing right here can actually bulge up as we clench our fists, which is one thing to be aware of. However, in a neutral state, it's going to form a shape similar to this. Now, we're going to apply the same logic we use to our fingers. This first joint is going to be bigger, as well as this first bone is going to be longer. And then each time we get further away from the wrist, it's going to get progressively smaller. Like our fingers, half of this last section is going to be taken up by the nail. And similarly, we're going to have angular shapes as well as a even thicker skin pad on the bottom for the thumb. Now, we've only covered the hand in a resting or neutral position. Once you start clenching your fist, we have to talk about the mechanics a little. So one thing to point out is as we close our fists, our fingers aren't going to go straight back towards our wrist. They're actually going to lean in slightly towards our thumb side. As we're clenching our fist, you'll notice this last section is actually kind of hard to see. A lot of the times you won't even see it at all depending on certain angles. So when you're drawing fists, you have to keep this in mind. When our characters are making fists, right, we want this middle knuckle to be straight in line with our wrist, whereas the middle and pinky ones are going to be slightly off to the sides. They're not making as much direct impact. If you plan on getting in a street fight anytime soon, make sure you actually hit them with these front 2 knuckles and not these back 2. If you make contact with these back 2, there's a decent chance you break your hand from your own punch. Anyways, getting back to our drawing, if you want to paint the hands, notice that a lot of times the knuckles as well as these joints right here are going to have darker/warmer tones on them because of the wrinkles as well as the increased blood flow in the area. Whereas in between the fingers right here and the back of our palm are going to be lighter and cooler tones. In addition, the ends of our fingers as well as our thumb are also going to have warmer tones, as well as the inside of our palm versus the outside. Now, for many areas of the body, it can be generally annoying to try and find specific reference for your exact use case. However, luckily for us, this is not true at all for the hands. If you're ever struggling, pick up your phone, take a picture of your hand in that exact pose or angle that you need help with. You can literally do it while you're working on your piece, and it will take a max of like 15 seconds. So I see no reason not to use reference if you're doing any kind of professional work that involves hands. Okay, so quick recap. Avoid making perfect squares for our palms. Instead, make it pointed or rounded towards the end right here. Our fingers and thumbs are made out of 3 bones, each of which gets progressively smaller as we get further away from the wrist. And those bones in our thumbs are similar to our fingers, except they're going to be much more rugged and thicker. Our nails are going to take up 1/2 of the last section of the fingers. And the bottoms of our fingers as well as thumb are going to be much rounder than the tops because there's thick skin pads. Make sure you include this drop from the wrist to the hand, and remember, reference is extremely easy to get. And lastly, thank you guys for the support on the last video. It did very well. I'm really appreciative of that. What I choose to do for videos is largely based off areas of my own art I want to improve, as well as what you guys put in the comments. So, if there's anything specific you want to see, leave a comment down below, subscribe. Oh, and while you're here, if you haven't already seen it, compliment these hands you can now draw with this arm drawing guide. I'll see you. Peace.